based on the study from last week, when we were kind of going through chapter 21, we'll kind of just revert back to that a little bit because it kind of gives us some good information, some important information leading into chapter 22. For those that maybe weren't here last week, or just as a reminder, Paul is in Jerusalem. He was arrested, chapter 21, verse 26, in the temple. The accusations against him in verse 28, basically, men of Israel, help. This is the man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he has also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place. So there's a lot of course, some false information, some accusations, a lot of hostile words as far as a Jewish background concerning the temple, and just as we've seen in many, examples, false accusations. A lot of times, even in today's world, false accusations are easier for some to believe than others, right? A lot of times when we're accused of something, it's easier for people to believe those things because maybe they're outlandish, or they catch people's attention, or they're the things that people want to hear, right? It's the things that you hear on the 6 o'clock news or 10 o'clock news. Nothing is ever usually a positive story that starts out, right? It's usually, so-and-so this, or this crime, or this, it's a negative things that get people's attention. And so we'll see as we get into chapter 22, some defense, some more information in how Paul handles this. Last week, we kind of got left, because of the way the chapter and verse breaks are, at least in today's translations, that we kind of got left on a cliffhanger at verse 40. And it said, when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hand to the people, and when there was a great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, saying, and that's kind of where we left off last week. And so I was going to back up to verse 37 here. Paul's been detained. He wants to address those accusers of him, those in attendance. He wants to address them. And those, depending on that situation, Paul has an explanation, and he wants to be able to speak. And so I'll pick up reading in verse 37, and we'll go through 21:37 through 22, verse 5, if you're following along. Then as Paul was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" He replied, "Can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" But Paul said, "I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people." So when he had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs, motioned with his hand to the people, and when there was a great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language saying, "Brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now." And when they heard that, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language. They kept all the more silent. Then he said, "I am indeed a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God as you all are today. I persecuted this way to the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest bears me witness, and all the council of the elders, from whom I also received letters to the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring in chains even those who were there to Jerusalem to be punished." So here we have this, of course, kind of going back, give you this introduction into this section. But the first thing we see here is kind of this false accusation in verses 37 and 38. Right? The question is, are you not the Egyptian that some time ago led 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness? That's an accusation right there. And Paul's like, no, that's not who I am. So Paul gives his his origin, his background in verse 39. I'm a Jew from Tarsus, Cilicia, no mean city. Depending on the translation, no mean city or obscure city or not an insignificant city. But we see, again, Paul's request, another word for that request, like an imploring, a desire, a great desire to address the people. Verse 40, we see he was given permission. We see he motioned with his hand, right? Sometimes, if you've ever been in front of a group of people, you're trying to get their attention. There wasn't a public address system, where you could everybody hear you, but you're trying to get their attention. So you're trying to get them to listen and maybe quiet down. And so maybe he raised and motioned with his hand. And you see his position. He was, in maybe an elevated place on the stairs to be able to address them. We see this mentioned in verse 40. We see, basically he says, he motioned the people and there was a great silence. Kind of like there is right now, right? Great silence, not a lot going on. And it's interesting because, he said, he had their attention, he's speaking to them, and then we see at the end of verse 40, he said he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, and he said, here's my defense before you now. And he says, when they heard that, interesting thing is when they heard that, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, they kept all the more silent. So different levels, right? Sometimes you might sit there and think, when you're in the house, maybe alone. I know that this weekend we were talking about, Jan and I were talking about both kids are gone on their retreat. So it's really quiet in the house, right? So sometimes you say, like, well, it's so quiet you can hear a pin drop. And so it's just really quiet. And so there's no reason that they can't hear him. He has their attention. And so we see his plea to them. We see to hear his defense. I like to look at a phrase, that great quietness, or even the more quiet, kind of the cause and effect of that. They hear him in the Hebrew language, and they kept all the more silent. Just, a good cause and effect, or how it was issued there. That word silence in the Greek, or all the more quiet, meant quietness or stillness, silence, desistance from bustle or language. Basically, what you like sometimes when you're at home and you have kids, or you're a teacher in a classroom, you're like, can everybody just please be quiet? It's that kind of quietness that he had their attention, and they were respectful of that at that point. They were respectful of listening to him because how he was addressing them. Verses 3 through 5, we have his background, origin, to establish his defense among the crowd. We have also we see the education and learning at the feet of respected Gamaliel, whom they all would have been familiar with. What do we know about Gamaliel? It's been back from beginning parts of Acts. Acts chapter 5, we hear him mentioned. I've brought it up in the last few weeks as far as kind of a wise, the wisdom regarding Paul's defense before. But in Acts chapter 5, verse 34, we see Gamaliel was a teacher of the law, held in high respect by the people, by all the people. They knew who he was. He could sit there and tell people, I'm set at the feet of Gamaliel, and they understand that, and they have a higher respect. They're not a higher respect, but they understand, and they're not going to discount that education. They're not going to discount the education of the customs that he had. He also said, according to the strictness of their father's laws, the Jewish laws, zealous towards God as they were. What do we see here in their effort to arrest him and detain him? They do it for no reason at all. They do it out of hatred. They had, basically I kind of describe it as they had kind of a zeal. They had a zeal for their beliefs, for their customs, for their upbringing. And they believed Paul was speaking against those things. And so whenever he said they were zealous toward God, also as they were, or as they are. He's acknowledging their zeal here. He's like, just as you are, I've been zealous. I've been these things. And so he's, sometimes when you want to have an explanation, when you want to maybe get against or try to prove your point or acknowledge, you have to acknowledge the other person's background or their intent. And that's what Paul is doing here. He's acknowledging them. He's like, just as you are, or just as you were. You have to open up that, give them that ability, maybe also that they'll hear him with his words. So yes.
I was just going to say, one thing that might have commanded a lot of respect was that not just anybody probably sat at the feet of Gamaliel. Paul was being groomed for really some big things within the Jewish religion. And so just the fact that he was a student of Gamaliel probably brought a lot of attention and respect for those around him to listen to him and see what he had to say.
Right. He definitely wouldn't, most likely he wouldn't have mentioned it unless it would have an impact. And there was a great impact. Those that, like I said, even back in Acts chapter 5, the respect that was given at that point, the wisdom there that we see, and the intent and the mention of it here definitely had a huge respect level there. No, thank you, Carrie. So, yes.
I think too, he knows what he's about to tell them.
Mm-hmm.
He's about to tell them that they're wrong. And so he's trying to make a connection with them that he's been in their shoes. He's been doing what they've been doing. He's been teaching what they've been teaching. And he discovers, he was wrong and he changed his mind. And so kind of looking at this, I think that he's trying to make a connection with them that, hey, I was in the same boat you were. Before he says you're wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, to give that.
We do that today.
Sure.
Even.
Yeah.
We try to help somebody straighten out maybe a path we've been down.
Right.
We're seeing them. You got to make that connection so that that other person understands, where they are.
Yeah, and I appreciate that's a great point, because no matter the situation, we could take pretty much any situation that we face today. Someone who's been negatively affected by drugs, or loss of different situations, whatever you name it. Pretty much, if you have a person that can identify with you on that level, they have experience in that, their experience in that, whatever it is, then you can identify, you can you're more comfortable maybe listening to their advice or listening to their history and what changes they've made. And so, definitely, like I said, the history that he had to identify with them, the experience he had, helped hopefully enable them to be wanting to listen and to have open ears and hopefully open hearts, which we'll see later. Necessarily, it wasn't always the case or wouldn't be the case, but yet we know that Paul's impact on many throughout his travels, throughout his teaching, impacted many different places, many different people, many different congregations. But no, thank you for the information there. So we think about the zeal that they had. What kind of zeal did Paul have?
He was persecuting people just like they were attacking him.
Right. Yeah, we read verses 4 and 5, but you can't get much. You're gonna sit there and just lay it out all on the line and say, I did this. I persecuted this way to the death. We can think about in the first few chapters in Acts when we read about Stephen, read about the impact there, read about, and I'll even sit there and mention this in a second, but this defense, this explanation he's giving his history, he's giving his past. And so there again, he can sit there and he's starting out with this because he's trying to help them understand and listen. It said, as Teresa mentioned, the changes that he's made that they need to be aware of. So maybe they will also be willing to change. Does anybody remember the effect? We think about all these things, these negative things, because if you remember before, even in previous, from Saul's conversion in Acts chapter 9, we're going to have a lot of repetition throughout this chapter, which is beneficial because repetition is a lot of times a good thing, but a lot of these things might sound familiar. But you see, in this, in how Paul was zealous, or Saul was zealous, what effect did that have on the early church? Does anybody remember that?
They were wary of if he was really, converted or not.
Right, absolutely. Afterwards, they were definitely weary after his conversion because of the name he had for himself, the impact he had on so many, because of some of the things he discussed here, killing, imprisoned men and women, Stephen, and so many things that he impacted negatively impacted the church.
We see Ananias' his reaction when he found out he was going to be teaching Paul.
Yes,
He was a little bit nervous, I would say, at the very least.
absolutely. Here's a zealous, high reputation. We see the zeal, the positive impact zeal of Paul, and then you flip that coin and go backwards, and you have that high level of zeal impact on the church that Saul had. And it's just, you take that, it's just, you basically flip that coin, and he had notoriety. He had a name for himself, and he was well known, but not in a good way. Not in a good way. So we look back at Acts chapter 8. If you want to turn to this, I'm just going to read Acts chapter 8, verse 1. Just one of the small impacts, because a huge impact, one of the small impacts, just as a reminder that Saul had at this time. 8 verse 1 says, Saul was consenting to his death. This is about Stephen. At that time there was a great persecution arose against the church which was at Jerusalem, and they were all scattered throughout the regions of Judea, Samaria, and except the apostles. Somebody want to read verse 4, please.
Therefore, those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word.
Thank you. So what was the impact?
Spread the gospel.
Spread the gospel. If you look back at Acts chapter 1, verse 8, kind of a thesis verse of Acts. Acts 1, verse 8, and I mentioned this several times when we were teaching the first part, but in this was kind of the outline, this was kind of the map, this was kind of the list of what was going to take place when Jesus was talking with the apostles. But yet, he said, but you shall receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you, and you shall be witnesses to me in Jerusalem and all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. So just as a reminder, the negative impact, even though that Saul had, the great impact he had, the negative, when it scattered Christians, it actually was a benefit to the church because they spread, they taught, and the church continued to grow. And so that's one thing we might or might not actually think about with a negative impact that Paul had, because we think about how much of a greater impact he has, and he a lot of times thinks about in his letters, he thinks about the negative things that he had done. But this, in a way, because of the negative impact he had, it was kind of a positive outlook. I mean, there was a blessing. There was a thing that took place, or at least the effect of it, the cause and the effect took place, and that actually helped the word be spread. I had another question. And just kind of, as I go through studying and I think and go throughout things, and there's not a right or wrong answer, but do you think if Saul's name had not been changed to Paul, that they may have known or heard about his influence? I was just thinking about that. He's up there defending himself, giving his defense. If he was up there and says, "Hey, y'all, I used to be Saul. Y'all probably knew me by my former name." They might have understood that. They might have said, "Hey, oh yeah, we remember you. We heard about you." But that wasn't the case.
I guess the estimated time from Paul's conversion in Acts 9 to now is about 20, this is not from my study at all, but about 20, 22 years from that point of Paul's conversion to now. So just from bringing that up here in Acts 22 could have rung a bell to some of them. Oh, yeah. Even though he doesn't necessarily bring up the name Saul, but just the recurrence and the strong persecution.
Yeah, and you're right. But based on the information, the study, about 20 plus years in that range. So some of them, like I said, definitely could have been in that situation or been around that situation. So it's just an interesting thing just to think about. And when I go through it, I think about these types of questions and thoughts. Some of them, might not really matter, but some of them help us appreciate the situation that Paul was in. Some of us help us appreciate, both sides of that argument or the concern or the things that he was facing. And we know, in Acts chapter 20, if you remember that from a couple of weeks ago, we knew that when he went to Jerusalem, he was going to be facing hindrances, basically. He was going to be facing things as the Spirit had told him these things were going to be coming to place. So he knew that these things were upcoming, that he was going to be facing certain things. But didn't mean that he could not give a defense or could not talk to them, help teach them, right? So let's move forward to the next section. We'll read verses 6 through 11.
Andrew,
Yes.
just before we leave this subject,
Sure.
I'm just getting you to think about, that there were Christians that never forgave Paul for what he did. There were people that probably lost family members and acquaintances and stuff that were people that were killed because of him and the influence and whatnot that he had. It just popped in my mind, a number of years ago, Jeffrey Dahmer, the guy that was heinous crime. Everybody totally understands that. And then, I read some things, as some of you probably have and know a lot more about than I do, but apparently a member of the church studied with him, and he was baptized. But we don't know. I think we tend to doubt, was that guy really converted? Just like a lot of people probably did with Paul. Did he really change? Or is he a plant? Is he going in there and getting more names and whatnot? But we know God forgives anything. And much easier than we do. And like I say, that's something that he dealt with, you can almost bet, for the rest of his life. People looked at him in a different way because of things that he had done.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it's challenging. It's challenging for us. If we put ourselves back in this type of situation, I could easily, see, at least initially, just like some of the ones we have recorded, like Ananias. Have you heard of these things this person is capable of? The things that he's done among those. Throwing women, men and women in prison and killing and geared against Christians and geared against the church. And it's just, you sit there and think about that, and you think about current situations, what it is today, and it's kind of like you might equate it to some of what Sam's lesson was this morning. When you think about the soul, right? You think about the soul. You have care for that individual soul. You have care, just like the person who would have taken the time to go speak or teach somebody in prison, or speak to somebody on death row, or speak to somebody. It's the same impact. You think that's an uphill battle, right? Not always the case necessarily in prison, because they might be rethinking some of their situation, but yet sometimes we we might pick, person A. We think, wow, that person, there's no way anybody's ever going to reach that person. And sometimes we just close the door and think, there's no way, I've tried, and I'm just going to go, focus on somebody else. And sometimes unfortunately, it is the case, but we still have to be concerned about that soul. We have to be thinking about souls. Yes, sir.
Well, it just triggered a memory when I was a kid. My parents had a man and his wife come over for lunch after worship, and my dad gave me a book about this guy. His name was Clyde Thompson, but at one time he was on death row, awaiting execution, and he was pardoned by the governor, but his wife was very instrumental in his conversion, and he had become a gospel preacher following a terrible life of crime, and he was guilty of murder and other heinous crimes. But that's just an example of somebody who had a reputation, and he's one of the last people that probably we would even think of to share the gospel with.
Yeah. That brings up totally side thought, but one thing I've thought about for years, and it's an interesting study, it's an interesting thought process, but a lot of times when we're talking about zeal, we're talking about purpose, maybe life purpose. If you take somebody that's been at the wrong end in thought, imprisoned, whatever it might be, and you're able to convert them out of that. Sometimes, like I say, they know what they've lost. They look ahead. They see good things ahead of them, and their zeal is all purposeful, like moving forward. Just in that case, the same thing that we see a lot of times, and I don't know if y'all have been familiar with it, depending on if you were raised in the church or not. But an interesting study, or just kind of a thought process, is it's interesting for those that have been raised in the church, which is a huge blessing. But a lot of times, their level of knowledge, or level of gear for evangelism, their level or that may not be as strong as those who were not raised in the church and were converted into the church. They have a greater zeal, they have a greater appreciation, they have a greater interest in teaching others because they've been on outside that situation. And I'm not trying to get into that situation, but that is a thing that we see. We see that, maybe we hear the word of a Christian apathy or something like that. We hear that, we see it, but sometimes that is something that exists among the brotherhood, and we have to be careful. We have to be careful in the situation that, especially those who were raised in the church of the blessing, we still need to have a great impact. And we see Saul converted to Paul. He had an impact, but that was, and we'll see that in a second, that was God's intent. God had a part in that, but God, through the conversion process of Saul, there was importance there that he had for Saul to do as Paul. So just interesting, but thank you for that. Looking forward in the next few verses, reading 6 through 11. This is part of his conversion, just to recount. Now it happened as I journeyed and came near Damascus at about noon, suddenly a great light from heaven shone around me, and I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? So I answered, Who are you, Lord? And he said to me, I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting. And those who were with me indeed saw the light and were afraid, but they did not hear the voice of him who spoke to me. So I said, What shall I do, Lord? And the Lord said to me, Arise and go into Damascus, and there you'll be told all the things which are appointed for you to do. And since I could not see for the glory of that light, being led by the hand of those who were with me, I came into Damascus. So we see here, again, this recount here, this word, the one who spoke to Paul, probably better translated, the ones who said it could not hear the voice. Some people will say that's a contradiction looking at this passage versus the passage in Acts chapter 9, because in Acts chapter 9 said they did hear a voice, or did hear the voice, and in this here it's saying they didn't hear the voice. And actually, when you look back at the original, the word hear or heard actually describes as a matter of explanation if they could, basically the word is comprehend. Could they comprehend what the words? They might have heard noise. They not only heard noise, but they didn't understand what was being said. And so that was kind of an interesting background there between the two situations. So this was basically, there's no contradiction. But we sit there and we think about also within that passage here, we see, I like to think about when we were in Oren's class, we're in Ezekiel, one of the things he brought up was example like a great wind or a great mighty wind. And thinking about just attributes and things of God. And here we also see in verse 6, it was about noon, a great light or a light in chapter 9:3 from heaven shone around him. What was the impact of that light? Great light or a light. What was the impact of that light? He was blind, right? He couldn't see. For 3 days, he couldn't see. He had to be led away. He had to be led. Here, just we're giving an example as far as light versus darkness and things like that, and that we are to be the light to those around us. But it's interesting that we see this pure, this bright, this great light, the impact that it had in this process here with Saul. It was just an interesting thing there. There's not really a good word to describe it because you could think as we have better technology, if we have better things like that, you go from incandescent to CFL, then you have LEDs, and then you have different levels of LEDs, right? Then it gets brighter and brighter and brighter for less energy consumption. But nothing we would have here would compare to this great light. It's more impactful than we would think. Even if you're in a dark room and you look at a flashlight, like a young kid, oh, look at this light. You might see spots for a little while, but your sight's going to come back. But this impact that Paul had, it was just amazing. Just think about it. Just helps us to understand and appreciate the power that God had, or that God has. That great light that impacted him. Yeah.
And I'm not saying that this is the same setting, but it makes
Right.
me think of that.
Right. I mean, definitely. If you think about the different avenues where we're shown attributes of God in different various ways, different passages, brightness of His glory, wind. I mean, different things, but yet it's mighty, it's powerful, it's impactful, and then of course those same attributes are definitely given to us through the Word. We could see that power, we could see that mightiness, we could see the love and the care and concern when we study and go through it, and we can have that greater appreciation for it. So.
Well, God probably knew somebody like Paul who had that level of zeal and that level of commitment to what he was doing. It wasn't going to be any average event convince him to look at the alternative of following Jesus Christ when he's been a persecutor.
Yes.
And so it would take a very dramatic, life-changing event to send in that direction.
Oh, absolutely. And there again, God knew exactly what he needed to do to make that impact. But yeah, it would take something to alter that or to interrupt that zeal that Saul had, basically, to make that impact, to catch his attention, I guess is a good way to say it, to catch his attention. Any other questions or comments about these verses? We'll keep on moving on to the next few verses, 12 through 16. Then a certain Ananias, a devout man according to the law, having a good testimony with all the Jews who dwelt there, came to me, and he stood and said to me, Brother Saul, receive your sight. At that same hour I looked at him. Then he said, The God of our fathers has chosen you, that you should know his will and see the just one, and hear the voice of his mouth. For you will be his witness to all men of what you have seen and heard. And now why are you waiting? Arise and be baptized and wash away your sins, calling on the name of the Lord. Again, this is, a lot of repetition from Acts chapter 9, verses 8 through 19. The interesting thing we see in this passage here that wasn't in the account of chapter 9 is this, that we see Ananias approaching Paul and says, basically, why are you waiting? There was a delay. There was some kind of delay there that we see there. And basically he's saying, why are you waiting? Basically, you arise and be baptized, wash away your sins. And so just as a general note, not that has any impact, but yet it was just an interesting kind of lesson for us to look at and say, here, this care and concern that Ananias had for his follow-through, for his teaching. Let me see if I can read the next few verses, 17 through 21. Now it happened when I returned to Jerusalem and was praying in the temple that I was in a trance and saw him saying to me, Make haste and get out of Jerusalem quickly, for they will not receive your testimony concerning me. So I said, Lord, they know that in every synagogue I imprisoned and beat those who believe on you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I also was standing by consenting to his death and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then he said to me, Depart, for I will send you far from here to the Gentiles. So until this point, when Paul's giving his recount of his conversion and basically the story behind it, he had their attention, right? Going back to the silence, the great silence. And then the key word came up. I will send here to the Gentiles. And as we get to that point, when we get to the next section, we'll see that they basically listened to him to this point, and then when they heard that, it is totally, they lost it. Basically, it said, they raised their voices and said, Away with such a fellow from the earth. He is not fit to live. And they cried out and tore off their clothes and threw dust into the air. I don't think we have time to go through it, but this is a huge impact. Just they're sitting there listening to this, and then they hear one thing that sets them off, and they hear the word Gentiles. You have a situation of like almost prejudice. It's somewhat, of course, religious prejudice. You could say it's racial prejudice. It's a lot of different things going on here, but yet you have a lot of hatred right there. Not just throw this person in prison, but they said, he is not, get him off the earth. He is not fit to live. Similar to, who would you hear something similar to this? Made to about Christ, right? Away with this man. Crucify him. He's not fit to live. And so it's just interesting, just the hatred that they had. All of a sudden, they were listening to this point, and that underlying, no matter what, maybe they had him to that point, and when he mentioned something, and they just forget it. They're done. They're done. And so, just there's different passages we talk about with Paul being sent to the Gentiles, but we look here and we talked about it earlier already, but we read about it already too, why Paul was selected or why Saul was selected. And he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name. This is Acts chapter 9, verses 15 and following. Bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel. Verse 16, for I will show him many things he must suffer for my name's sake. So we know this from studying Paul's impact, Paul's history, the life of Paul that he did suffer many things for the sake of Christ. But Paul was a chosen vessel. He was there to teach to others, to go to the Gentiles, to go to others, to teach others. And so we see this impact, but there again, just think about, this amazing, when we started out the chapter, this amazing quietness that was had, amazing silence. And then all of a sudden, away with this man, he is not fit to live. Just what an utter change, right? Sometimes we all have words that might set us off, we don't hear, where we don't like to hear certain things, we don't like to hear certain people's words, maybe certain people, maybe certain situations. But here, it wasn't, it didn't seem like it was just one or two people. It was like the whole crowd erupted here. And so what an impact this had. And I think Paul knew that this would be the case. I think he started out giving his defense, giving his information, and then when he got to that point, he knew, as we'll continue next week, knew the impact that would set them off. And then when we get to the rest of chapter 22 next week, we'll talk about what took place next. So thank you all very much for your comments and attention.